Welcome to this BC Rural Center webinar. Improving relations between First Nations and municipalities is one of the most important issues facing rural British Columbians. Finding effective ways to manage the development and economic transition of First Nations and neighboring communities in a collaborative, mutually advantageous fashion is a real challenge for many. Which is why we're delighted to welcome Hegus Clint Williams of Tla'amin Nation, Roy Francis, Chief Negotiator for Tla'amin, and Mayor Dave Formosa of the City of Powell River to today's BC Rural Center webinar. To begin, gentlemen, I wonder if I could ask each of you to tell our listeners and viewers something about your respective communities. And Hegus Williams, I'd like to start with you, please.
Sure. The Tla'amin Nation is in a quite exciting place these days. We've spent some 20 plus years on negotiating a treaty. Treaty came into effect April 5th, 2016, and we're in the process of implementing and developing areas within our local government. It's been a wonderful process getting away from the Indian Act that really kind of shackled us down, and the opportunities that are in front of us are amazing, and we want to make the most of them. Being in the Powell River area, we're quite a captive audience here, so we feel the best thing we can do is communicate as the three local governments, the City of Powell River and the Cothet Regional District. So we're happy to have open lines of communication with our neighboring governments and looking to improve the lives of our people and provide a brighter future.
Thank you, Hegus Williams. Roy Francis, anything to add to that?
Just echoing what Clint has talked about. I served in a role as Chief Negotiator for our nation. Negotiations began 20 plus years ago. We're 3 years into self-government, and I think our future is looking very, very bright. We've got the treaty provides lands and resources and lawmaking authorities, and it's helped us to build a more level playing field, I guess, with the province of BC, with Canada, and with the city.
Okay, thank you, Roy. And Mayor Formosa, tell us a bit about the City of Powell River.
Well, the City of Powell River was once a very thriving community that enjoyed some of the absolute highest incomes per capita in Canada, boasted the largest pulp and paper mill in the world in one location that was totally self-sufficient, right down to where they manufactured their own molds for creating parts for their paper mill, huge lathes. They were totally self-contained. They didn't need to rely on anybody, given the very early 1900s and the isolation of the community. Subsequent, we had a strong history of mining on Texada Island. We enjoyed a great fishery. We enjoyed, major logging operations, et cetera, et cetera. Subsequent, the new world, the age of communication and the Industrial Revolution kind of left behind. Powell River has been struggling to find its feet again. I'm proud to say we found it in the last, I'd say, 3 years. We've been thriving in this community in many ways, and just basically enjoying the fruits of our labors collectively. We joined together, and we'll get into that later, basically as a team with the Tla'amin Nation as well. What's good for Powell River is good for Tla'amin. What's good for Tla'amin is good for Powell River and the whole region. So things are changing, but we're adapting, and we're getting there. We're growing again.
Okay, terrific. Thank you for that. Well, that's a perfect entree to our next subject. Let's talk a bit about how that relationship between Tla'amin and the city of Powell River has developed and evolved in the 21st century. I know that in a recent piece that our executive director, Gordon Borgstrom, wrote for the BC Rural Center on the relationship between your two communities. There's a chapter title, if you will, in the report called From Conflict to Collaboration. So in 2002, the city of Powell River began work on a seawall walkway. And I understand that that led to some controversy because of an absence of consultation, and that potential conflict led to a new collaboration. I'd love to hear the three of you talk to that a bit. Perhaps we could start with you, Hegus Williams.
Yeah, sure. Back in 2002, it predates my time with the Tla'amin government. But what had happened was there was, I guess I would just call it an innocent mistake from the local city government at the time. They were wanting to build this seawall, and the consultation process was not really sorted out too well, and it wasn't a perfect system. It still isn't a perfect system, but the city was just installing a seawall, and they tracked through a midden which had some petroglyphs buried in there, and so the exposure of the petroglyphs with the pathway basically created a conflict as the shell midden was kind of crossed. So with those artifacts exposed and the archaeological team needing to be called in, the city and Tla'amin were able to come to a compromise and improve things. So that was kind of the start of the improvement of the relationship. So that's kind of where the conflict, from conflict to collaboration, really was born, I guess.
Okay, and Mayor Formosa, what was the city's take on this? I know, of course, you weren't mayor at the time, but you might have a perspective on what Hegus Williams just said.
Yeah, that's correct. I wasn't the mayor, but I was there for the whole incident as I was the director of the Tla'amin Development Corporation, as was Roy. And so I was on the other side. I was with Tla'amin and brought them into this chamber, my team, to have this discussion with the city and to kind of set them straight on some of the issues. And Chief Hegus Williams hit it almost 100%, but there was also one other issue, and that was the divestiture of the harbors from the federal government to the provincial government to the city of Powell River. And under the Delmuth decision back in the day, it should have been well known that consultation and meaningful participation was expected when Crown assets are released. So we also came to talk about these ports and the funds that were with them, and which ports could we see come to Tla'amin based on the fact that they were still in government's hands, which meant they were under negotiation under their treaty work there. So we had two issues to work through, and that one was a little uglier than the petroglyph issue and midden issue. But those were the sparks that led to the good work of the past council under Stuart Alsgaard, the mayor at the time, and his council. And the 2003 Community Accord was created.
Okay, so can we talk a bit about the community accords and protocols? As I understand it, for example, in June of 2004, there was an additional protocol on culture, heritage, and economic development. So from a very specific kind of historical, cultural issue, something much broader started to take shape. what was the impetus for that? And was there any pushback from within your respective communities? Hegus Williams?
I believe this is the protocol agreement. So it was the accord and then the protocol agreement. So I don't think there was any real ever pushback from our community per se, but we're pretty intertwined with the Powell River community. So we kind of hear both sides of this story, but our community have been kind of used to being on the outside looking in. And I think there's been some positive influences. I remember seeing an early OCP from the city, and I think we had maybe about one sentence in that OCP, and it was, there are some Indians that are to the north of Powell River, the Tla'amin village. That was it. And so, you know, like progressing from that early OCP with the one sentence to, I think we had a whole chapter or something in the latest OCP. So just kind of that evolution of this. So you'll never ever have everybody 100% happy, but our people do celebrate the relationship because it's done a lot of good for our people. You know, we have a bus that travels out into our community, whereas that just never would have been heard of back in the day. So the city sends their bus out there for two or three runs per day. So the people without vehicles really appreciate that, and that's just a very minor piece. There are bigger pieces to the puzzle, but just kind of wanted to mention that this relationship has benefited our community.
So just as a point of information, physically, how far apart are Tla'amin and Powell River?
If you look at it in terms of communities, you know, the Wildwood community is about 5 or 6 kilometers from the Kishosam village, and the center of Westview is probably anywhere between 10 to 15 kilometers. So kind of there's pockets of community. So there's Wildwood town site and then Westview. So about 5 kilometers from Wildwood, about 7 kilometers from town site, and roughly 10-ish, 15-ish from the center of Westview.
Okay. And Roy, let me quickly reintroduce you, by the way, because we've had some new attendees come in just a little late in the webinar. We're speaking today with Hegus Clint Williams of Tla'amin Nation, Roy Francis, who is the chief treaty negotiator for Tla'amin, and Mayor Dave Formosa of the city of Powell River. And we're here today talking about the relationship between Tla'amin Nation and the city of Powell River. So Roy, from your perspective, do you believe that now that Tla'amin has moved toward a treaty situation, as Hegus Williams described, it's easier in practical terms to be a partner with a local government like Powell River? And if so, why?
That's a very good question. And I would say the answer really simply is yes. We are in a much better position to enter into and implement relationships with the city. A good example is about land areas that our nation secured in our final agreement. Those land areas are right adjacent to the city of Powell River. Most recently, some of the land area is within the city boundaries of Powell River. So the treaty sets out provisions where our nation can convert those lands to become Tla'amin lands. It does require the consent from the city for that conversion, and the city has provided those consents. So that's a really recent development, and probably the best example of, I guess, a relationship in action. I think that's not been done anywhere other than here. So it's a good indicator of the strength of that relationship, I believe.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that sounds unprecedented to me. Mayor Formosa, what's your take on that?
Well, you know, I agree totally with both my colleagues. The relationship started off from problems and quickly grew into a lot of paperwork, whereby, you know, within the accord and such, we showed areas where we would be sharing with the First Nations road name changes, land developments, areas that we need to be aware of where we need to do archaeological studies. And we did a whole lot of you know, that hard text work. And then everybody needed to share patience on the government's actually then enacting that as development and such happened. And you know, and it has all worked out, you know, very well. There's still, you know, quirks and such. At the beginning, you know, there was some issues with the public, and there still are. But at the beginning, there was more issue where I think the public was just afraid. What is this going to mean? How far does it go? But I have to say, over the last, you know, 15 years or so, that we've enjoyed this relationship, that the vast majority of the community is on side. And that was expressed when the city kind of floated the idea through the newspaper that we were considering to sanction the treaty settlement lands within city jurisdictions. And, you know, the amount of, there was no backlash that I'm aware of that hit the social media. There was talk amongst the coffee shops and, you know, those certain, you know, areas, but we expected more, and we were all quite pleasantly surprised that the public went along with our council's, you know, ability, and I want to say being brave enough to say, yeah, we're going to have a different structure of government and taxation on lands that we owned or that we were government of or partially owned at the time in partnership. And so, you know, the relationship has had so many wins that it's hard to explain, really. When we apply for grants, Tla'amin will be after a grant, they'll come to us for support. We're applying for grants or partnering on projects. The power between the two of us, or even with the Kathot Regional District, in some cases the three of us, when that goes forth to the next levels of governments and they see these partnerships, in a lot of areas, we move to the top of the line. And that, you know, that's a huge win for us and others that may want to consider, you know, sitting down with their neighbors and friends and rolling up their sleeves and having those tough discussions and the good discussions, because you know, they're not all tough. So yeah, I kind of forgot the question, but I hope I answered it.
Thank you. So actually that sets us up nicely for a conversation about an example of what you've just outlined. I know that in your opening comments, Mayor Formosa, you talked about the importance, the historical importance of logging of the lumber industry in Powell River and your surrounding region, and how that's been a bit of a roller coaster over the years. And I know that there was an issue with a company called Norske Canada in Powell River that led to ultimately, as I understand it, a joint venture between the city and Tla'amin. Gentlemen, if you could speak to that a bit, that would be very interesting. Perhaps we could start with you, Hegus Williams.
Sure. It's actually kind of funny to talk about that relationship now, given the players that were at the table at the time, because Roy and Dave were on the Tla'amin Development Corporation back in the day when these interesting happenings were occurring. And to look back on it today with Dave sitting in the mayor's seat, it's actually pretty humorous. So,
I changed sides.
You have changed, or you've changed not at all?
Yeah, I haven't changed it all. It's actually been beneficial with all the knowledge and love that I have for the community, and they, embraced me with my own native name and such. So I think it's also helped carry on what Mayor Elsgaard started, but carry on, Hegus.
So yeah, I had to let you introduce that part because it is pretty funny. So there were some interesting moves going to happen, and some of the discussions, like I said earlier, you'll never please 100% of the people. The mill owners at the time were looking to sell off surplus lands that they had, and just to help with their cash flow. And so
Now, excuse me, but these are lands where?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, then that were owned by the mill at the time. So
Within the city limits.
So basically, acres and acres of lot 450 that are within the city limits. So they were looking to sell these off because they were surplus to their needs. So lands that were owned by the mill, and so rather than have them sold off in a big bulk sale, our development corporation members at the time took it upon themselves to have a meeting with the mill and to explore this unique opportunity. And so from that discussion, PRSC was born. So Powell River, Tla'amin, and Canada. That was the birth of PRSC.
Okay, and these lands are located inland or on the waterfront, and what possible use might this new corporation make of those lands? What was the thought when those negotiations with the company were first taking place?
So the lands were financed through the mill owner at the time, and they were going to be sold for economic benefit to the three parties. So it was 800 acres that was up for sale, and it was made up of about half a dozen different pockets of land. So the original thought was that the three parties would sell these as PRSC and split the money evenly, of course, paying the mortgage down as these parcels sold. So the total of the mortgage was $4.5 million to mortgage, which the mill owner kind of floated internally, and then as each parcel sold, they would pay down that loan with the profits and split the remaining.
Okay, so just to be clear, PRSC is a jointly owned entity between the city of Powell River and Tla'amin Nation. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, and we actually just dissolved it last year. So it existed 15 years?
Yeah, about
15. About 15 years. 15 years, we dissolved it last year.
It served its purpose.
Okay, and so over those 15 years, what developments took place?
Want me to step in? Sure. So you asked, where are the properties? So they were made up of waterfront lands, beautiful waterfront lands, inlands, and external lands. If you look at they were all within the city limits. So they were at the outside edge of the city, in the middle of the city, and on the waterfront. The city of Powell River ended up, through the partnership, getting a very good deal from the partnership of Millennium Park, which basically goes from Wellington Beach right to the mill site. Although the park doesn't go all the way to the mill site, but the lands did, right up to the edge. Tla'amin ended up getting a beautiful piece of waterfront adjacent to their First Nation lands, and that was, I don't know, 80 acres or so, 100 and some odd acres, that parcel.
I think it's bigger than that. Yeah.
Or 245 acres.
Yeah, it's just 80.
Yeah, and that was turned into treaty settlement land. It's adjacent to Tla'amin. So we got a beautiful park. Tla'amin ended up getting their adjacent beautiful waterfront properties. Also, what started this whole thing off was Tla'amin wanted, at the time when Roy and I were with the Development Corporation, we were looking for a waterfront location for booming and logging as that company was growing within the First Nation Corporation. And that's why we went to the Norske Canada to purchase that piece on the waterfront that Tla'amin also ended up with. I think we suggested that Tla'amin took a nice chunk of waterfront area. The city ended up with a nice chunk of waterfront area. Tla'amin wanted originally, what started the joint venture and us acquiring that land together was Tla'amin was after a booming ground for their growing logging operation. And that's when we first reached out to Norske Canada for that piece of land, which they agreed to sell to Tla'amin. It was Tla'amin at the time. Subsequently, Norske came back and said, no, we're not selling it anymore. We're going to sell the whole parcel that's in, and we have a buyer, and it ain't you guys. And we got pretty upset at the Tla'amin Development Corporation. We, very upset. Subsequently, we came up with an offer and said, well, we'll buy the whole works then. And they were shocked. But we ended up pulling it off and creating, the PRSC lands. So we now have the booming and logging operation that Tla'amin has, and that's treaty settlement land. The portion of real estate, the 200 and some odd acres adjacent to Tla'amin, is now treaty settlement land. So that's, going to see more development. There's new jobs created there. The city also purchased a large portion off of the joint venture that was adjacent to their park on their waterfront property across the street. And I also mentioned we sold some of the properties jointly for farming, for real estate development, and a resort possibly on a piece of it that we sold in the Wildwood area. And then we came to a point where a lot of the land was sold. Each of us looked at 2 big chunks of land that we liked, and we decided to take them. So Tla'amin took one piece, we had it appraised. We took a piece, we had it appraised, and we wound down the company about a year and a half ago. And so now they have their piece, we have our last piece, and it was a very worthwhile project. It came with a lot of controversy in the community. It was craziness. Folks really got weird. They didn't really believe, I think, that we were buying this together for the community. And I think that folks thought there was ulterior motives. And so Hegus and myself were always under fire by a small population of the community that, they should have been rejoicing because there was outside influence that we're going to buy this property. Millennium Park wouldn't have happened. The beautiful waterfront property adjacent to Tla'amin that's now given back to them in treaty settlement land that should have been theirs, that was taken away from them when they were put on that reserve. That land adjacent, that 245, was part of the First Nation parcel, and the government at the last minute took it away. So we had a lot of pleasure in getting that back to Tla'amin and making it their government land. So there's, some of the uses that happened, and there's more development happening with Tla'amin's piece on their own and with the city's piece on our own. So it's still giving back to the community.
Understood. So
the one part that I feel that today that seems unfair is I've been watching our friends take some heat over some of these purchases, and the one thing that I find unfair to them is the properties were listed for years and years as PRSC, and there wasn't an awful lot of bites. They were for sale for a good 14
on the
15,
market,
listed with a real estate agent, and there was next to no bites. So I feel it's kind of unfair that people think that the city is kind of just doing something really quickly and brash. They're not. Those properties have been listed for years and years, and I just feel it's unfair that people were kind of
leading us up.
Yeah.
Okay, so against that backdrop, let's finally, in this final segment of our conversation today, talk about the future. I'd love to hear each of you just share your thoughts, given the relationship that's evolved between your respective communities over the last 15, 20 years, where you see future relations going. Do you see more actual joint venture-like collaboration in the cards in the future? Do you see, just in general, better communications between your two communities leading to more collaboration? Roy, perhaps we can start with you.
Sure. My thoughts about the future are the continuation of collaboration. For our nation, I mentioned we have a very significant land base area. We've got about 8,000 hectares of land, and that land requires servicing. That servicing means roads and water lines and sewer systems. And we're in discussion now with the city about how we go about accessing and providing for those needs. So I see like cost sharing, or I see some kind of partnership type relationship going forward to provide for those needs. And I think the environment is ripe for that. The discussions have begun over the last few years about upgrading wastewater facilities within the city. And I see Tla'amin being one of those participants, I guess, in helping to develop that.
Hegus?
Not to try to repeat everything that Roy said, but I see opportunity. I see on top of those service agreements and arrangements, opportunity for the city of Powell River and the Tla'amin people as a whole. I think once we develop new neighborhoods, it works and it helps to benefit not only the Tla'amin people, but also the people that are looking to relocate to Powell River or relocate within Powell River. So providing opportunities for families to grow, and as was mentioned earlier, what's good for Tla'amin is also good for the city of Powell River. I think our economy is in a bit of a challenging place. The mill is facing some tough times, and we're always willing to try and help where we can, to try to get our foot in the door, to try to help improve things around here, because our people need opportunity just as much as the people within the city limits and the regional district. So any opportunities created go across the board, and they create opportunities for everybody within the Tla'amin traditional territory. So we're excited. I think the future looks bright, and we want to make the most of it.
Mayor Formosa?
Yeah, so echo everything my friends said. Plus, I guess I'll add that as far as the liquid waste facility, it's a $70 million expenditure, and we are partners. And for that reason, I believe we have seen activity from our senior levels of government for funds that have come already, to us for design and engineering. And when it says that the liquid waste facility will service the city of Powell River and the Tla'amin First Nation, they go, what? So we're building it together. That's happening. So there'll be a pipe coming from the Tla'amin lands where the folks are living, right along the highway connecting into Wildwood, where Hegus explained was the first 5-kilometer gap between our two communities. So that will be, connected. That's happening. That's big. Also, when we talk about the service agreements, well, now we'll have more people to help us pay for our infrastructure, because they're going to be building assets and such on their lands. We'll have service agreements, but also while they're building those assets, people are working. When the folks in Tla'amin, we're all one community. But when the folks in Tla'amin want to go shopping, they come to Westview. They want to go to the movie, they come to Westview. They want to go skating, they come to the complex in the city. We're all one big family, and like all families, you know, you have a lot of good times and you have a couple of squabbles. But we always get through it. And when things sometimes get really tough, you know, and we did hit a few of those, and then Hegus Williams grabs the accord and says, "Here it is. This will help us through this one." And sure enough, we all took a big chuckle and laugh, and okay, let's do this one. And we arm wrestled it down, and it wasn't as bad as we thought it would be, and that was the treaty settlement lands. So, you know, the infrastructure that you put down on paper that people think is just a waste of time, it is not a waste of time. You've got to set your thoughts in writing and then try your best as friends and neighbors and family to work towards that plan. So, you know, we're even talking outside the box stuff, and, you know, I don't want everybody to freak out or whatever, but we're even talking about the fire hall. Maybe somehow Tla'amin can help us build the new fire hall. We're willing to look outside the box at different ways of doing things because we've been doing that together for so long. As our resources are limited because of our mill, it no longer pays 30% of the tax base of Powell River. You know, it's more like 10% or 5%. At one time it was 30, 40%. And we've been cutting it back, trying to keep them alive and staying here. And for the foreseeable future, we have new owners. It looks pretty good for the foreseeable future. But we know we have to rely on each other here, three of us, and the region, you know. I think we have a stronger relationship with the Tla'amin Nation than the region, but that's also working out in everybody's favor. We're all alone here in Powell River. We like it. It's safe. It's a great place to live, a great place to raise your family, and we're proud to be living within the traditional territory of the Tla'amin Nation.
Okay, so in conclusion, if there was one thing that you each could say to the folks who are listening to this conversation right now, and to your fellow British Columbians, both First Nations citizens and non-First Nations citizens, based on the history of your respective communities' evolving relationship, what would that one thing be, starting with Roy Francis?
The one thing for me would be opening lines of communication. We walked through that timeline of when our conversations with the city of Powell River began, and it began at a point of conflict. But beyond that point, there was improvements, there was development of relationships, and I think it's a positive experience for us. So we travel quite a lot and are invited to participate in community development discussions with other First Nations. And the relationship that we've established in Powell River is a really special one. It's not out there for everybody else.
Thank you. Hegus Williams?
You know what, I think back at about 2008, when I was first elected chief, I got asked to go to the pulp and paper, 100 years of pulp and paper in Powell River. And I thought, oh my God, this is suicide for me to go to this event. With the mill and town site is on our original village site of T-Squab. And I thought, man, this is the worst event for me to ever go to as an elected chief. And I thought, maybe I should just cancel. And I thought, no, I'm not going to cancel. I'm going to go, and I'm going to go share the opinion of the Tla'amin people at that time. And I was really glad I did, because moving ahead, Powell River's really been a model of reconciliation as we've been kind of heading through. And I think there's a write-up we did a year or two ago when we talked about reconciliation action. It was in one of the New Year's Eve messages. And I think Powell River and Tla'amin and the regional district have kind of been they've been walking the walk and talking the talk. So, you know, as we move forward, all we can do is build on those positive things. And of course, there will be disagreements, but at least we're at the table having those discussions and trying to improve that. So I really personally like where we are and where we're heading.
Mayor Formosa, what's one piece of advice you would give to other municipal leaders in rural British Columbia?
Mine would be spend some time and really understand the culture of the First Nations neighbors that you enjoy having in your area. Really understand that you are living in their traditional territory. Understand the culture, understand where they came from, understand what British colonization did. It's worth it. It's worth it. Once you do that and you have an idea of the culture, you know, family orientated, friendly type of folks that their culture is all about, their land and how they lived, then don't be afraid. You know, as Roy said, reach across the aisle and ask to have a discussion. But I've always found, and I've told others that have asked me that want to do business with First Nations, a lot of my colleagues, because I was, you know, a businessman before I became a mayor, is I say, understand the culture, understand the people. And I think that'll help take you a long way, because that's where the conflicts are in a lot of areas, in a lot of cases, is you don't know the history, you know, and so learn that and then move forward. I think it'll help a lot.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much to our three leaders today: Hegus Clint Williams of Tla'amin First Nation, Mayor Dave Formosa, City of Powell River, and Roy Francis, Chief Treaty Negotiator for Tla'amin First Nation. We're very appreciative. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time. And thank you for, and through you, your friends and neighbors in your communities for the inspirational collaborative work that you've gone through and you've accomplished over these past decades. We wish you well in the future. We encourage other folks who've been listening and watching who live elsewhere in rural British Columbia, both First Nation citizens and non-First Nation citizens, to take some lessons from the experience of Tla'amin and Powell River. The entire province will be a better place if they do. And now I'm just going for a second. We're not going to record now. I'm just going